the pastor of the Federated Church of East Arlington, and I represent the Interfaith Council of the North Shire, and we are thrilled that you are all here today and you've taken an interest in this important topic of immigration. We want to thank our partners in bringing this program to you, the Manchester Community Library, and we also want to thank GNAT-TV, who you should know is here filming this. It will ultimately be on GNAT, so that if you have friends or neighbors who missed this program and want to see it, it will be coming soon to a screen near you. Susan has an illustrious career behind her. She has been working for Senator Leahy and on our behalf for the last 11 years. She's come to us from Middlesex, Vermont, and her specialty, her area of expertise in the Senator's office is Homeland Security and the State Department. So issues associated with that, which is thus why immigration is part of all of that. And before she joined Senator Leahy's office, she served as an immigration lawyer, was the executive director of the Vermont Human Rights Commission, and worked as an assistant attorney general for human rights, and earlier as an attorney with Vermont Legal Aid. And she's also done quite a bit of training on diversity and equity. And it is our great pleasure to welcome Susan here to Manchester.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and my first thanks go to Kathy Clark and the Interfaith Council for inviting me. I think it started with a conversation with one of my colleagues who said to me this morning, "It's my fault that you're going down to Manchester today." I said, no, I was thrilled with the invitation and jumped right at it. And a thank you to Cindy and the Community Library of Manchester for this beautiful space. And GNAT for convincing me to say yes to their taping this. So you've heard of some of my background, and in working for the Senator, I do a lot of constituent service work. So having come from practicing immigration for a number of years, I now help all of you, help constituents with any issues involving immigration, border issues, passport issues, issues if you're traveling elsewhere and need to be connected to an embassy. So it's a pretty broad portfolio. And the Senator, as many people know, what the Senator's office is available for is to help people with all kinds of issues involving any federal agency you can think of. And we have people who have specialty in the office on Social Security, veterans issues, IRS, things like that. So when we arranged this date, when Kathy and I arranged these dates, we were looking at a whole bunch of different possibilities, and I was pushing it out as far as I could, because I figured by now, DACA would be done, immigration, any changes to immigration law would all have been worked out, the wall would have been built, no. So I'm shocked that so much of what I thought was on the edge of being completed is, from what I understand this morning, nowhere near an edge, or a different kind of edge than we were expecting. So there's new news every day. And what I'm going to do is give you, what I was asked to do, and I think this makes sense in this order, is to give you a little primer on immigration law. So I'm going to condense an immigration law semester-long course to about half an hour, okay? And then I was thinking about this in 3 acts. This is a presentation in 3 acts and a curtain call. So the first is going to be a short overview of how do people come to the United States legally? What does, how do people become immigrants and are able then to live and work in the United States? And then Act 2 will be an overview of non-immigrant visas, people who are coming for a temporary purpose and for a temporary stay. And then Act 3 will be covering a little bit of the world for refugees and asylees. And then the curtain call, though, which is usually a happy thing, but in this case is not going to be as happy, will give you an idea of what has happened with the current administration and the changes that have happened or that are being proposed to occur that touch all of everything I'll have talked about before. I'll try not to end on too negative a note, but then I really would love to have a conversation with people, answer questions if I can, and just even hear your thinking on all this. This is not an easy topic. I never presume how people feel about immigration. It's a very, very hot topic. And as I said, in the news almost daily. So, how do people get to the United States so that they can, in fact, become a permanent resident and eventually a U.S. citizen? So there is family immigration and there's employment immigration, and then a few other specialties. So people who can come because a family member has petitioned for them, and it goes through an agency, a subset of the Department of Homeland Security, and that's USCIS. People still say INS. I can't break the habit for people, but it's USCIS, which is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. And we actually have one of the 5 service centers that adjudicate those petitions in St. Albans, Vermont. And they don't just do cases for New England, they do applications and petitions from all over the country. And they get divided up by form type, what type of application. So family immigration by law right now is capped at about 226,000 family petitions that can be, where people can get immigrant visas annually. And you can petition for someone, a family member, either if you're a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And I'm going to use that term LPR a number of times. And LPR is somebody who has a green card. Not really green, but it's, they're never going to change how people refer to it. So a U.S. citizen, and it's different folks that can be applied for. So a U.S. citizen can apply for their fiancé, their spouse, their minor or adult children, or their parents. And the process, for U.S. citizens, I would say, except for adult children, all those other categories are, family members can come, probably takes about a year. Some less, some more, depends upon how well the petition's done, whether you've left things out, and they tell you got to submit more evidence. But that's really how long that probably takes. And it's not just going through USCIS, who looks at the applications and adjudicates them. All these folks then have to go through an interview at an embassy or consulate abroad where they're living. And so it's a double process, USCIS and then a U.S. embassy, with all kinds of screening, security screening, medical exams, interviews, and that's a pretty long process. Now, an LPR, a person who's a permanent resident with a green card, can apply for a spouse, minor and adult children, and siblings. Those categories take a long time for people to come. If you are applying for a brother or sister, it could take 15 years. Yeah. And that's because there is this limit on how many immigrant visas can be granted each year. When I talk about these numbers, I'm talking about individuals, not families. One visa is for an individual, not for one person and their family. Okay, so they get taken up. And every month, the Department of State issues something called a visa bulletin. And it is a whole chart. I have to teach this to interns all the time. It's a whole chart, because they check this for me every month. There's a whole chart for family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. And depending upon how many visas were issued the prior month, will adjust specifically for people who are, particularly for people applying for sibling. Actually, I just realized I have this wrong. Only U.S. citizens can apply for siblings. I put that on the wrong line. So for siblings and then all the LPR categories, they have to wait. It could be a 2-year wait to bring a spouse here if you have a green card. It could be a longer wait for other people. And it then gets broken down by country. This is very complicated stuff. And so, thank God for the tables, that's really helpful. And so if a person is coming from China or Mexico, the Philippines, and one other country that, well, it will come to me, that it could take even longer. So, you have to wait until there is a visa currently available in order for the person to come. So, it's not an easy process. And a lot of the work that I do, actually, at Senator Leahy's office, is keep an eye on some of the applications, help people, figure out, what direction they should be going. I can't give legal advice working for the senator, but I can provide information. So I figure out where the line is in that as I talk to people. So after somebody has come to the United States through family immigration, after they've had their green card for 5 years, they can apply to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. And if they've come through marriage, then it's a 3-year wait before people can apply to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Some people wait decades. There are many reasons that people wait before they apply to become a citizen. It might be because they think they have to give up their original country's citizenship. And it's really what the U.S. says is if you become a citizen, a naturalized citizen, you are swearing allegiance to the United States, and the U.S. only recognizes the fact that you're a U.S. citizen. But it's up to your home country whether you have to give up that citizenship when you become a U.S. citizen. So that's a factor that plays in for people. Germany said no for many years, you couldn't be a dual citizen, and then they changed the law, their law, and people could retain their German citizenship. Chile, I happen to know that because our son-in-law is from Chile, and he waited until that law was changed before he applied to become a U.S. citizen. I go to most of the naturalization ceremonies, and I always, I'm curious for some people who look like they may have been here for quite a while. How long have you had a green card? 35 years. So it's always interesting to see what goes into this. If you look at the flyer that either Kathy or Cindy put together, Cindy, behind me, behind the photo of me, taken by one of my colleagues, are the 4 naturalization certificates of my grandparents. So they all came as immigrants in end of the 19th century and then into the 20th century. So reminds me of a lot about the work that I do. When a lawful permanent resident becomes a U.S. citizen, their minor children automatically become citizens. And they can either apply for a U.S. passport to claim that citizenship. If the parent has naturalized before the child is 18, but the child doesn't do anything about it, they then have to apply to USCIS to become a citizen. So that's family immigration in a nutshell. Employment immigration, limited to about 140,000 visas a year, much more complicated. There is a whole process for how an employer applies for someone to be able to come as an immigrant and get an immigrant visa through employment. They have to show there's no U.S. worker qualified to perform the position. It involves both the Department of Labor, needing to get a certificate from Department of Labor, as well as USCIS. It includes categories like priority workers, people with advanced degrees or with exceptional abilities, skilled workers, special immigrant visas, and investors, investment visas. I actually did name all the countries. I just saw my notes here. China, India, Mexico, or the Philippines, long waits, years and years to come in the 3rd category for skilled workers, just really a long, long wait. There's also, people can also come as an immigrant if they've won the diversity visa lottery. And this is the green card lottery. And it's limited to 50,000 people a year. I know these numbers sound large, but when you're talking, when you see how this happens, it doesn't feel quite as large. And the green card lottery is only available to people in certain countries. Every year there's a list of who can apply, and they get about 3 million applications, out of which 50,000 lucky, that's not 50,000 people, it's 50,000 visas. So it could be one person who wins the lottery and they bring a family of 5. So that will take up, so that's what I mean by it's not, even though it's individuals, there are a lot of kids involved in this as well. And countries are not eligible if more than 50,000 immigrant visas have been issued from people from that country over the prior 5 years. So, you know, that's how the countries are chosen each year. And as we know, the Trump administration is wanting to do away with this method of coming to the United States. They want to do away with the diversity visa lottery. I've worked with a lot of people who have won the DV lottery in Burlington and Chittenden County. So it's still active and still going. So that is immigration, you know, for immigrant visas in a very, you know, brief overview. I know I'm getting in the weeds on some of this, but stop me if I'm saying something that, you know, doesn't make sense. But I'll keep going otherwise. So, Act 2, non-immigrants. And this is a huge category. You would start with visitors. Now, if we want to go, if Americans want to go travel, you know, there are laws that, you know, we have access to many countries, to be able to go to many countries in the world without applying for a visa. Or you apply for the visa at the airport when you're entering the country. Coming to the United States, if you want to come for a 2-week vacation, you want to go to Disneyland, or you want to visit a relative, you want to come for your child's graduation or wedding. These are a lot of folks that I deal with each month. If you come from what is called a visa waiver country, so that's all of Europe, Scandinavia, Chile is on the list, South Korea. So interesting, you know, the countries that get on the visa waiver list are countries where there's a very low, less than 3% people who don't go back. So it's what we call a very low fraud rate. That people, in fact, they get the visas, and they get the visas, they come on visa waiver and they go home because they're coming from a country where it's highly likely that they want to go home, okay, as opposed to the rest of the world. And so when you come on visa waiver, it's also, there are restrictions. You can only come for up to 3 months. So it's only for 90 days, and it's really strict. If you violate that and you do go home, but it's 95 days, you may never come on visa waiver again. Okay. So if you're not coming from a visa waiver country, then you have to apply for a visa, for a non-immigrant visitor visa, either coming for business or pleasure. There are some, I work with businesses who have potential clients who want to come and see the product here, and they have to apply for visas as well. And that involves making an appointment, you know, waiting until you can get an appointment, and then going into a U.S. embassy or consulate for that application to be interviewed. There is a fee chart. Actually, yes. If you're applying for immigrant visas, then if you're applying for somebody and you're here and you're applying for, let's say, a spouse, there's the initial application fee. There are fees then that go to the Department of State. There are other fees to actually get the visa. So it's all over the place. I don't have the numbers on how many how many visitor visas get accepted or rejected, granted or rejected, but because mainly I'm hearing from people who have been rejected. Okay, and the main reason that people are rejected for a visitor visa, for whatever the purpose, the consular officer at the embassy or consulate really doesn't care why you are wanting to come to the United States. Again, it could be for a wedding, for a graduation, for, you know, just a visit. They don't really care. All they're looking at is, do we think that there's a good chance this person's going to come back home? And the presumption that the consular officer starts with is anybody who's coming to the United States is coming to stay here. Because most people who, 11 million, however many people who are in the United States who are undocumented, most of them came on a non-immigrant visa and just overstayed. It's not just floods across the Rio Grande. That's not really how most people, like 75–80% of people, are just visa overstays. So that's why the consular officers are really looking at, and they have tremendous discretion. Actually, they have pretty much absolute discretion. So they are going to decide, does this person really look middle class? Do they have property? Young men from South America are going to have a hard time getting a visitor visa. People from Russia are going to have a hard time because there's a high fraud rate in Russia, that people do come from Russia and stay. And that's just an example. That's true for many other countries as well. So we call those 214B denials. That's part of the Immigration and Nationality Act that governs this. So there are a lot of denials. But there are lots of people who can come as well. And so there's no cap, there's no number of how many non-immigrant visas can be issued. So those are visas, non-immigrant for visitors for business or pleasure. There are non-immigrant visas for students, and there are particular criteria that a foreign student, an international student, needs to meet in order to be able to get that student visa. I also work with all the colleges and universities and some high schools in helping get through the process to bring students here. And there are many people who want to come to study in Vermont and who don't get the visas. Had one wanting to come to a particular program, and they said to her, well, why are you coming all the way to Vermont to study Chinese when your country is right next to China? And it was because she had a scholarship to do it. It was a great deal. She had connections with the school and really wanted to be here. So she's trying again. We're hoping second time it'll work. Then there are performers, musicians, actors, athletes, special visas for all these different non-immigrant categories. When a person comes as a non-immigrant, except for the students who would stay for the duration of their study, for the most part, there's a third agency that gets involved, and that's Customs and Border Protection. So you could have been granted the visa and come to the border, and a Customs and Border Protection agent can look at your application and can decide at that point to keep somebody out. They may look at somebody's passport and they say, well, you came as a visitor 4 times this year. You've barely lived in your home country, and you're not really supposed to be here for more than 6 months in a 12-month period. So, you may just have, even though there's all kinds of complications, and there are many different roadblocks in the way. There are also then temporary workers, and people have talked a lot about temporary workers in the last few years. There are particular employment categories, an H-1B category, which enables actually people to come for 3 years with a 3-year extension. But these are for highly educated foreign professionals to work in specialty occupations that require at least a bachelor's degree or higher, or an advanced degree. And they mainly, I would say about 2/3 of all of these H-1B applications and visas for employment are in the STEM fields, in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And then there are others in healthcare, business, finance, and life science industries. So that's where these H-1Bs usually are hired into. It is capped at 65,000 visas annually. The demand for H-1B workers is so huge that I think it's 7 out of the last 10 years, they've reached the cap within 5 days of people being able to apply for these visas. And so April 1st, and these happen up in St. Albans. The Vermont Service Center puts on, talk about temporary workers. They put on temporary workers to handle the literally tractor trailer loads of applications that drive up to St. Albans and deliver all these paper applications. And they run out of visas. And so there's this huge demand that comes in, and then they often hold a lottery. So you think, phew, I've gotten it in early, my business needs, 3 H-1B workers, and, but then they go into a lottery, and they could not win the lottery and not be able to have their application even considered. I won't go into all the weeds on this, but there are CAP-exempt types of occupations in working for a university and some other things. But there's debate every year in Congress about whether to increase the cap for H-1Bs because the demand is so high, but hasn't happened for H-1Bs yet. So, and even in hiring H-1Bs, an employer has to take steps to ensure that hiring a foreign worker will not harm U.S. workers. They have to get a certain kind of certification from the Department of Labor. It would have to show that the H-1B worker would not adversely affect the wages and working conditions of similarly employed U.S. workers. So that's those kind of temporary workers, which are sort of long-term. They're 3 years, and I would say people who come as H-1B, in the H-1B category, also, if the employer really likes them, that's when they're going to be applying for the permanent green card employment visa. And that's often how that progresses. Then we have H-2B, H-2A, and H-2B. I know I'm throwing all these things out at people, but it's helpful to just give you what the categories are. And this is temporary workers, agricultural workers, and non-agricultural workers. So Vermont employers here try, when they say they can't find local people to do these jobs, they're relying on people from other countries. And that's in our, in lodging, in hospitality, in restaurants, H-2B workers, and often young people, coming for a U.S. experience. And they're just here temporarily, and then they have to go. And H-2A, we're talking about people who come to pick apples, people who are working in various farming positions. And again, these, the one category that's not included in H-2A agricultural workers are agricultural workers who would be working year-round. And who's that? Dairy farmers. Okay, and so we're going to talk a bit more about dairy farm workers in a bit. But I'll tell you, Senator Leahy has tried for years to fix this, and it has just been walking into a buzzsaw, between all kinds of things. There are certain exceptions for year-round agricultural workers, but that hasn't changed in a while. Somehow sheep herders are allowed to be here year-round and come on H-2A, but not dairy farm workers. So do our dairy farmers, would they like to hire folks and go through a legal process? Of course. But there is no option for them. No option if they can't find local people to fill all these jobs, and they're looking to hire, other workers because they're desperate. There is no option to do it. So the senators tried to do standalone bills. The most recent was a bill with Senator Feinstein to big ag jobs bill. It would have created a new visa for agricultural workers. It was a fairly comprehensive bill and just dead in the water so far. Okay, so that's a lot about immigrants and non-immigrants. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about EB-5?
Sure. Sure. And actually, I just read the latest this morning. EB-5 is part of that investor visa category where people can come if they invest a certain amount of money in a business and mainly in rural, economically depressed areas, though there have been finagling so that all of a sudden in the middle of Manhattan there was an EB-5 project. But if you, in a rural area, the investment has been $500,000, so $500,000, and you have to show that the investment would create 10 jobs in the United States for that business. And so that's what has been used by to get investment capital in a number of businesses in Vermont. Sugarbush, the Trapp family brewery, a number of others, and then the big one, J. Peak. Okay, and that many people here know a lot about that. I saw people answering that question, saying J. Peak, where the business, it was definitely a sham that was happening up there, and it was a real heartbreak. In the meantime, some great businesses, some great projects were accomplished there. And I remember being up there once and talking to, a worker who was a person who had an electrical company, saying, these projects that they were working on, all of my crew now is able to have, go home and have dinner with their children instead of having to do work out of the state. It was creating a lot of employment up there. But some of those projects were absolutely not going to go anywhere. It's, as we've all found out. And what I'm understanding is that in the omnibus that was just passed, there are changes to the EB-5 program, and a lot of that's going to also happen in rulemaking, but I think it increases the investment to over $1 million, like 1.35 million, is I think the number I saw. But it's, some people think the EB-5 program is great, and other people say, oh, it's just wealthy people buying a green card. There's all kinds of, discussion on all of that. So we could talk about that more. Did you have a particular question about it, or just what it is?
Just basically what it is.
Okay.
And it will continue now.
Yes, at this point it will. Though Senator Leahy said, he was saying if there aren't the kind of changes that he and Senator Grassley had worked out changes, proposed changes, and they had a joint bill that to increase security, increase oversight, financial oversight, all of this. And if none of these things happen, the senator was not going to support the continuation of the EB-5 program. And I really just got a quick glance at this morning, so I don't know where all of that, if any of that went in. I think it was just a continued program with raised numbers and some oversight, but I actually am not sure about that. And take my card and I'll send you an email, write to me and I'll send you an email with the real answer. Yes?
Is there a time limit on a green card?
How long you can have it for? Good question. If you come as a spouse, you get a conditional green card for 2 years. And then after 2 years, you have to apply again to remove the conditions from the green card and prove that your marriage was not fraud, that it was...
The person who receives the green card.
Yes.
Is that for how long?
2 years, and then...
What?
Oh, the other ones.
The person who actually files for the green card receives the green card and brings his family here.
No, let me clear that up. You can't do that. You cannot apply from out of the country for a green card to come to the United States. Somebody in the United States has to apply for the relative. Yes. So, people can't just apply for a work visa. They can't just apply for a green card if they're outside the United States. They have to be petitioned for by somebody in the United States.
But you don't have to be a resident of the United States.
To apply for somebody, you have to either be a U.S. citizen or a person with a green card already. Thank you. That's a very important point. And then when you come to the United States, so I'm going to give the spouse example. You apply for your wife, okay? And when your wife comes,
And your children.
yes, and your children come, they will get the green card in the mail. okay, after they've been approved for their immigrant visa to come.
And how long does it last
For a spouse, 2 years,
for the children?
also 2 years. And then if you've been married for less than 2 years, okay? If you've been married for 5 years and, then you apply for your spouse to come. When they come, they'll get a 10-year green card. So the green card lasts, after the conditional one, it lasts for 10 years, and then you can keep renewing it. Or you can apply to become a U.S. citizen.
Living in America any
I'm sorry.
longer?
Excuse
Even if they're not living in America any longer, they stayed for X number of years, say 5 years. They move back to their country.
They lose the green card.
They lose it?
Yeah. You have to be a resident of the United States to keep your green card. And if you leave for more than 6 months, it raises a presumption that you're not really intending to live in the United States. And if you stay out for 1 day more than a year, they can take your green card. They can go through a process to take your green card.
Another question.
Yeah.
Can an American citizen adopt a young woman who's like 25 or so?
No. Okay. Yeah. You can do, I haven't even mentioned international adoptions.
Well, that's what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, is international adoption. If someone has been in America as a student and doesn't want to go back to her country,
They cannot do that.
they cannot be adopted.
No. That's an interesting idea, but but
All the DACA children could try.
oh, what a great idea!
So why don't we pass that kind of a law?
I love that idea. I'm going to take that back to the office.
I'll adopt it.
I love that idea. But international adoptions are other ways that people come, the children come. It's a very specific program. I can't remember the age under which, how old or young a person needs to be adopted. But there are all kinds of, many steps in international adoptions.
All we want is for the immigrant or foreigner is to marry someone, an American. That's
Valid, and in a valid marriage, not pay somebody to, that's what the consular officers are interviewing people about, fiancés as well as spouses. I've worked with people who swear up and down that this is, the love of their life, and, they're from the same country, and they've gone home and they've married somebody from their country, and then when they're or engaged to be married, and either the spouse or fiancé goes into that interview really nervous, because you can imagine it's their life on the line, and they get denied, and they sometimes get denied.
homosexuals.
Same-sex marriage is, yes, ever since the Windsor decision by the Supreme Court. But there are people who get denied, and they say, we think this isn't a valid marriage, that you've just, paid somebody to be able to get to the United States, or, we ask questions and they didn't know enough about what your brother does. You really get grilled, okay? And then they return the case, and sometimes, I had one person who, he was sticking with this, and the case got returned twice from the embassy. And it wasn't until the third interview, after many years, that his spouse was allowed to come to the United States. And they've had great business, and they're still together, but she couldn't convince a consular officer during those interviews that this was a for real marriage. Okay, my last, sure, okay. And there was somebody in the back also. Hold on one second. There was somebody in the back who had a question.
Yes, I'm not so much in favor of seeing the rate raised from $500,000 to 123 or whatever. I'm very much concerned with the lack of oversight right here.
Mm-hmm.
That was wrong.
Absolutely.
We blew it, we lost. Vermont lost the ability to have oversight. I was transferred, I believe, to New York.
The regional center was, yes, the regional center, because they had transferred before they were closed, they had transferred the financial oversight to the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, who was doing, I shouldn't give an opinion about what happened at the regional center, but they had transferred that oversight to a Division of Financial Regulation, who was then part of, one of the lawsuits.
I'm very disturbed by the fact that, but for VT Digger,
Mhm.
malfeasance in this state does not get covered in the newspapers the way it should.
Hmm.
Because we all need to be accountable for
Mhm.
our work,
Mhm.
especially when there are monies involved to that degree,
Yeah.
and people's lives are affected.
Mhm. Yeah, there are lawsuits continuing, ongoing. I think there was a settlement by one of the investors yesterday who involved in there. Some of the folks were able to, I think, and the receiver has been doing a very good job. The person who, is in charge up there now, the receiver overseeing the whole transition.
And where is the receiver from?
I can't remember, but supposedly what everybody says is that he's been doing a very responsible job for the investors and everybody. So but yeah, there's a lot that's still part of that, and it's been terrible, as you said, for Vermont, especially since it had started off really well up at Jay Peak, and then certainly went south. So the last part, before I talk about what's now going on daily in the news and in immigration, are refugees and asylees. Most of the time, before I go on, you had one more question.
I want to know, how is the lottery picked? How do they pick for the lottery?
I think it's an electronic,
Out of a bag or?
some electronic system that does this. Yeah. Okay. So, is there some comment there about hacking into the electronic system? No. So I'm usually, when I'm speaking about all of this, I'm usually on a panel. I think I haven't counted. It's about 8 panels that I've done since January 21st of 2017 that has been for people in the immigrant and refugee community, and mainly in Chittenden County. Because people have just been in such confusion about, whether they can travel, whether people can come here, whether their relatives are going to be able to get here. I mean, there's so many questions that people have, and we usually are working in a room. This is great. I'm able to talk much quicker on the panels. We have at least 5 translators in the room, many different languages being spoken, and I just did one last Wednesday. So now I'm even more in my wheelhouse on refugees and asylees. So the other way people come to the United States is through the Refugee Resettlement Program, or people who are in the United States and who then claim asylum. You can only claim asylum if you're in the United States. You can't apply for asylum from outside the United States, but you can apply to come as a refugee. Very small numbers here. And so the Refugee Program worldwide is run by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. And the definition of a refugee is a person who has been forced to flee their home country to escape persecution, war, or violence. There are about 22.5 million refugees worldwide. And in order to be referred for resettlement, a person has to meet some vulnerability category, women and girls at risk, survivors of violence or torture, children at risk, urgent medical needs. Less than 1% of all refugees are ever resettled in another country. And even though what UNHCR says is that there are about 8% who are in need of resettlement. The number of refugees resettled worldwide dropped by over 50% in 2017 over 2016. So that's not just here, it's worldwide, though I think that was tremendously affected by the changes in US policy. The process for being resettled in the United States has in the past taken 2 years, up to 2 years, sometimes more. for people to be able to come as a refugee. UNHCR does the initial screening. Then if they refer somebody to be resettled in the United States, there is a long process, a long process. It involves, this is from UNHCR, it involves 8 US government agencies, 5 background checks, 6 separate security databases, and 3 in-person interviews. So UNHCR does the initial, then Department of Homeland Security does an interview, and then there are others after, and then there's a final one after that. People need medical exams. They are only good for a certain amount of time. They have to redo their medical exams almost every year. It's just a long process with significant security screening, and now there will be even more security screening and take even longer. Now, the U.S. only accepts refugees who have a well-founded fear of persecution based on religion, political opinion, race, nationality, membership in a particular social group. Again, the way officers look at these cases, I have seen people who are already here as a refugee, and actually refugees here in certain circumstances can apply for family members who are still in a refugee camp in, let's say, Kenya. And they can apply maybe to have that refugee family member join them. But I've seen some family members get rejected if their stories are inconsistent with other family members. If they say what happened in the home country, they tell a slightly different story than some other family member. Inconsistency is a major reason for rejecting somebody that I've seen. So if somebody gets through all of this, and if they are accepted for resettlement in the United States, then the person gets referred to one of, I think, 9 NGOs in the US. And Vermont is a resettlement state. And they're through USCRI as the parent company, parent NGO, and Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program is the entity that refugees get resettled through. And the travel is arranged by the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They arrange the final plane travel. And when the refugee family arrives, or refugee individual arrives, they're already in debt because they have to pay IOM back for those plane tickets. And they work out a payment plan to repay. So, everybody says, refugees come and they're given everything and lots of money and, supported forever. That's not true. There's definitely some cash benefit that people can have for up to 8 months, or if they get a job, that cash benefit ends. And the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program does help people find an apartment. So there is an apartment for folks before they get here, but the rent is not paid for them. They have to, work it out through what they're getting and then through employment. And there are other benefits in social service support from the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program, some help in finding employment. So there's a lot that goes on there. Senator Leahy would say is that we have a broken immigration system. And he has been trying really hard for a long time to get this fixed. In 2013, when he was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he was in charge of getting the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill through. And it, in fact, passed out of committee after very public hearings that were streamed and available for people to watch for hours. All amendments considered, and it not only got out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, but it passed the Senate with bipartisan support. And that was really our last chance then, last best chance to get comprehensive immigration reform. And then, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, knew the bill would pass in this House, and he would not allow it to come up for a vote. You will hear Senator Leahy talk about this a lot because it was so frustrating. It was this close to overhauling the entire immigration system with border security, and many other changes that would have made a lot more sense, would have brought people out of the shadows, would have created a pathway to becoming legal, and it's nowhere near there now. Yeah, the question, sorry, I have not been repeating the question. I apologize, GNAT. The question is the definition for political asylum. That's something I'd have to get back to you on. It's pretty complicated. And, you know, so, because political asylum is only one type of asylum, one category for granting asylum, but I am not an expert in that. So I'm happy to get back to you on it, okay? So now comes the bad news. Not that I haven't been sharing some already, but let me just do a few minutes on this, and I won't get too far into the weeds on it, and so I'll be able to take more questions. So I sat down to make a list of all the changes that have occurred under the last year and 3 months, and you know, I'm not here to make a political statement, but I think we can agree, because it's very vocal and it's in the news every day, that this administration does have a war on immigrants and refugees from the beginning of, you know, of taking office. And there are people who agree, many people who agree with it, and many people who don't. So many of the changes actually have happened in the weeds and have not really been in the newspaper as much, and then there are the big ones that are out there. So the Refugee Program is one of the first that was targeted. And the first thing, because it was within the power of the president to do, he cut the number of refugees that the United States would accept for resettlement. Under the prior administration, President Obama had increased the number from 80,000 annually, just 80,000 refugees, to 110,000. And some of that increase was to be able to accept more refugees from Syria. Okay. So it was at 110,000. And then as soon as the new administration came in, they cut it to 45,000 for this fiscal year. And the prediction from a number of organizations is that they only expect, so it's 45,000 is what the cap is, but the prediction is that only about 21,000 refugees are going to be resettled in the United States this fiscal year. As of March of 2018, there was just a drastic drop in the percentage of refugees admitted who are Muslim. 13% of all refugees so far have been resettled this year, down from 48%. So significant changes, and the effect that the president and this administration wants. There was an executive order freezing all refugee resettlement, including, and I haven't even talked about the follow to join refugees, for refugees who are already here who can petition for their family members. I'm not going to go through all those executive orders, but there was then another order that lifted the freeze but added additional vetting requirements. It was accompanied by a memo from other agency secretaries that described which categories of refugees would get priority for resettlement, and talked again about the additional security screening that refugees who are already going through 2 years of security screening will now have to go through as well. And this concern about refugees from 11 countries that were totally frozen and now are being told, we'll take you after we take people from other countries. And this is Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Mali, North Korea, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. So sometimes one of the bans has to do with 8 countries, another has to do with 11 countries. This is the 11 country restriction. They're saying these people from these countries will be considered on a case-by-case basis, might be considered for resettlement, where their admission is deemed to be in the national interest and poses no threat to the security or welfare of the United States. I work with a lot of people from Somalia, refugees from Somalia, who have come through Vermont Refugee Resettlement. And I have to tell them very frequently, it's going to be a very long wait for your relatives to come. They've been waiting for a very long time. They've been waiting for spouses, and minor children, and it's just, and parents. It's very disheartening for people, and we're not sure when or if this will ever change. The Vermont Impact. In FY16, Vermont resettled 386 people. In FY17, there were 236 arrivals, even though Vermont had been approved for 350. Mainly, most recently, the refugees to Vermont have come from Bhutan, Burma, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and Somalia. In the first quarter of FY18, only 70 refugees have come, none in March. And I just saw the director of VRRP the other day, and she says they can't predict how many are going to come, but it's just going to be a significantly smaller number. She's already laid off some of her employees. Department of State this year has asked all refugee NGOs to zero out any new settlement sites. So Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program, who had set up a satellite office in Rutland to accept refugees, mainly from Syria, some from Iraq, shut down. Okay, that can't continue anymore. Okay, the next piece of the good news is travel ban number 3. And so I'm sure people have read a lot about this, and I'm not going to go through travel bans 1 and 2. They're gone, they're history. But then came travel ban number 3. And this is the travel ban that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear a full hearing on. I think it's this month. I think it's going to be in April. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court has enabled this travel ban to go into effect, even though there have been, not even despite, there were lower federal court decisions finding this travel ban to be a violation of the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, about having to do with religious freedom and non-discrimination on the basis of religion, and or in another court found, an appeals court found travel ban number 3 to not be within the authority of the president, that he went beyond his authority in instituting this. So this travel ban applies to people coming to the U.S. either as immigrants or non-immigrants. So all those categories I was talking about, this travel ban has an impact on. And I'll tell you the countries first. Chad, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, North Korea, and Syria, where there's a total ban on any kind of immigration and or entry. And Venezuela, but only for certain government officials and their families who are applying for visitor visas. And some people think that Venezuela, nobody comes from North Korea. I mean, we haven't taken people from North Korea ever, I don't know, but certainly not for a long time. That these countries were added so it doesn't look like a Muslim ban. Okay, but pretty much that is the focus here. And there are some exceptions in this. For example, in the executive order, people coming from, so this has to do with all immigrants and non-immigrants, and some exceptions are in Iran, students and exchange visitors might be able to come. Let me see if there's any other. Oh, in Somalia, it stops all immigrants, but non-immigrants might be just subjected to increased security. Of course, we don't know how long that's going to take, but that's in there as well. Otherwise, these are total bans. And even though people from Iraq are not prohibited under the travel ban, they're going to be subjected to special vetting as well. There are lots of stated exceptions and waivers that are within the discretion of the consular officer for people from these countries, from these 8 countries. Except when you look at how many waivers have been granted, in the first month of the travel ban, I think 2 waivers were granted. There are over 8,000 pending visa applications, okay, at the consulates. And as of sometime earlier in March, only 100 waivers have been granted. So this idea that, if you're coming to join a family member and strong reason to come, et cetera, we're not seeing these waivers being granted, even though it's in the list of criteria for being able to apply for the waiver. Okay, that's the travel ban. Yes.
Is it a travel ban or just a delay of 16 to 90?
No. That was, those delays for 90 days and 120 days had to do with the refugee program. These are complete bans. Thou shalt not come. Thou shalt not be allowed to enter the United States. Okay, DACA. So, I think a lot of people here probably know a lot about this and what happened on Sunday morning. Oh, does anybody not know what DACA is? Great. So, Sunday morning tweets and Monday morning tweets where the president has said, DACA is dead. And that was one of the tweets. So, you know, I think, well, I'm not going to editorialize too much on that, but he basically says, he's saying it's done. I don't necessarily know that that's true because things change. 2 weeks before he said DACA is dead, 2 weeks before he was blaming the Democrats for not getting DACA done. And then he said in the tweet, but we will not abandon DACA. So, but 2 weeks after that, DACA is done. I had some conversation with people about why DACA didn't get included in the omnibus bill, and my understanding is that because there was absolutely no guidance from the White House about what they would accept, then Republicans who were, you know, wanting to do this were saying, you know, we don't know what our parameters are, and they were unwilling to even discuss DACA in these negotiations. So, you know, and there are many Republicans who want to get a fix on DACA. I mean, the compromise that had been worked out with Senator Durbin and Senator Graham, and, you know, I think you've read, they went in to meet with the president to, you know, get his approval on all of this because they had worked out a lot of hard things, including getting rid of the diversity visa lottery and increased funding for border security and all these things. And that's when they walked into a room full of what we call are called the hardliners on immigration, who were saying no, we're not going to do it unless they moved the goalpost pretty far down the road, and it did not happen. Another thing that has happened that seems symbolic, but I think is important to know about, is USCIS. The mission statement for USCIS has been changed fairly recently. And what they did was they took away the concept that the United States is a nation of immigrants by taking the language out of the mission statement of USCIS. So the former mission stated, USCIS secures America's promise as a nation of immigrants by providing accurate and useful information to our customers, granting immigration and citizenship benefits, promoting an awareness and understanding of citizenship, and ensuring the integrity of our immigration system. And that's been there for a while. The new mission statement. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services administers the nation's lawful immigration system, safeguarding its integrity and promise by efficiently and fairly adjudicating requests for immigration benefits while protecting Americans, securing the homeland, and honoring our values. You know, it gets rid of the concept that we're a nation of immigrants. Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting because I think people felt that this was now a new focus on. This is a more punitive focus than accepting focus. Not to say that people who don't qualify shouldn't. The people who don't qualify should be granted any benefits. You know, I think that everybody takes their job seriously. There was an internal conversation between the new head of USCIS and staff. And this was, I guess, somebody who had taped it, but it was an interesting exchange where there was pushback about this mission statement from within USCIS. And basically the answer was, you know, it's our job to do what the president wants. That's what our job is as federal employees, and that's certainly what they can do. But it was interesting. And Leon Rodriguez, who was the former head of USCIS, wrote an op-ed about this mission statement change. That was also very, very, very interesting. I'm certainly not giving any advice. Are they subject eventually? So right now, I neglected to say, right now, the courts have put a hold on getting rid of DACA, on having, because DACA would have expired, okay? So right now, people who are DACA recipients can apply, because of a court decision, can apply to renew their status, but no new DACA applications are being taken, can be taken, okay? So the risk that people who applied for DACA clearly have taken is that the government now has their information. And are they subject to deportation if the court case goes all the way and comes out against the DACA recipients? Can they be deported? Yes. And are they identified? Yes. Can they be found if they're there? Yes. Okay. So that is a perfect segue into the next part, which was going to be the fact that we're seeing a big increase in arrests and detention. Absolutely. And I will say there was a significantly high number of deportations under the Obama administration as well. But there were priorities. The focus was to be on people who are criminals, people who have committed felonies in the United States, and that would have been that was the focus of deportations, and then people who had entered unlawfully after a certain date. So there were a number of other priorities. Under the current administration, there are no priorities. It is completely appropriate under the current guidelines for ICE that anybody who is here unlawfully is subject to deportation. If they're discovered, they can be deported. Yes? That's a different question, and that's not, the cities are not saying we're not going to ship people out. The cities that are in the so-called sanctuary cities and states, they're saying we are not going to be asking people their immigration status, and we're not going to be handing people over to federal officials because we're enforcing our city and state laws. Immigration is a federal law. It's not a city or state law. It's a federal law, and federal immigration officers can do what they do. So it's a.
Obey federal law?
Excuse me?
Don't we have to obey federal law?
Yes, but in terms of resources and enforcement, what some cities and states are saying is that we're not going to spend our resources where we want to be spending our resources going after criminals. That we are going to leave immigration enforcement to the feds, okay? Because the states and cities can't enforce immigration law, and it's up to them whether they decide to ask people their immigration status or not. So they feel that it would be, sort of a chilling effect on people coming to report crimes. Because if you came, let's say you were the victim of severe assault, okay? And normally you would go to the police to report that. But if you're undocumented, people who are in the so-called sanctuary areas, the officials are saying people are going to be, are going to feel that they can't come and report crimes that have happened to them if it's going to subject them to deportation. So it has a really bad impact, and that's what a lot of people are saying. So there has been a 30% increase in ICE arrests from 2016 to 2017, and the number of non-criminal arrests, people who are just picked up, I'll tell you, we've seen a lot of dairy farm workers being picked up and detained, soared by about 150%. So people who had nothing other than the fact that they entered illegally, have never broken any other law, are subject to deportation. Yeah. There was somebody who was just recent, and you may have read about the gentleman from Illinois who has a green card, okay, not DACA, which is sort of a temporary status. Somebody who has a green card, served tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, came back with serious PTSD, got into drugs, sold some cocaine to an undercover cop, and was convicted of that and was serving a 15-year sentence, and halfway through that, he got deported. The rest of his family are US citizens and everything else, but he was deported, even though there was a strong push to not have that happen. So could a DACA person? Yes. There's not going to be any protection in the services.
They want to come to this country.
Okay, so a few more things that I want to cover for dairy farm workers. And I want to say that, you know, Customs and Border Protection, it's more often CBP, Customs and Border Protection, who pick people up and question their immigration status, and then they get turned over to ICE for ICE detention. But CBP does have a really important role here on the northern border. They really do stop a lot of drug smuggling and contraband smuggling, human smuggling. And so I don't want to say that, you know, that what they're doing is, you know, terrible. They have a very difficult and important function securing our northern border. But CBP's jurisdiction is within 100 miles of the border. And they have authority to, within that 100 miles, to question people about it's a question about how much they can question, but they have certainly stopped people. They say, well, if this is an area where we know there's been human smuggling, and when this car drove by us, the person in the passenger seat scrunched down. So we went and pulled them over, determined the person was unlawfully in the United States, and then turned over to ICE for deportation. And that's happening more and more. And you can imagine it's not just somebody smuggling who's going to be scrunched down in the seat when they drive by a Border Patrol car, but somebody who knows that they're here unlawfully. And that, you know, the impact is it's leaving, you know, dairy farmer with cows to milk and not having their worker there. It's the farmers who have been, you know, very concerned about this increase. What they're seeing is an increase in detentions. There was just recently the Vermont ACLU challenging CBP's now sort of new, or I would say reinstituted practice of questioning people who are boarding commercial buses and asking people about their immigration status or their citizenship in the United States. And the ACLU is challenging CBP's ability to do that. That's a good question. You know, they'll say that there was suspicious activity. They had suspicion. I have heard, because of the increase in detentions, that some employers who have crews from out of state, this is an anecdote, okay, actually somebody who was involved in one of these businesses, had crews from out of state, some that were fully legal and some that may have had some undocumented workers. It was the presumption, the employer had not been asking people their immigration status, except to look at, you know, documents to be able to hire them. And people who are undocumented coming from out of the state to do temporary work here, if they're people of color, they've lost those crews because they say, we stand out too much in Vermont, so we're not going to come. Yes, that's what our laws say. You know, there's you know, in terms of hiring and things like that, it's a different topic, but something I'm very familiar with. You know, the laws say you cannot refuse to hire somebody on the basis of race, color, national origin, and many other categories. That's in U.S. and Vermont law nationwide. So there have been, you know, people who are going into family detention. You know, you've read the stories about small children, 5-year-olds, being taken away from their mothers and put in a different detention center in a different state. All of this is, and the administration will say, we are taking action to discourage people from coming to the United States illegally. And this is one of the things. The newest policy that I heard just a few days ago is that ICE will no longer release women from detention who are pregnant. It has long been the policy that pregnant women are not kept in detention, especially because people show up for their hearings. It's been like over 90%, I read, of women who are pregnant, as opposed to the men who are pregnant women, when they're released from detention because they're pregnant, they come for their hearings. It's not like they get released and disappear into the fabric of American society. They do show up for their hearings. But again, it said we want to discourage people from coming to the United States. So from trying to enter the United States illegally. Because, anyway, this can go on and on. There's things that, and one more thing, it's a little bit in the weeds, but it's important. We're also seeing a big increase in immigration judges not willing to, well, it has been, I'm sorry, I want to say this. People have been detained even though they're married to a U.S. citizen. So if the person is here unlawfully, but when you apply for, if they've overstayed, if they haven't been in illegal entry, if they've overstayed a visa and then married a U.S. citizen, but haven't gotten around to applying for their green card, or they are in the process, the green card process has started and they're waiting for USCIS to get through their processing of this, judges have administratively put an administrative closure on that case to let that USCIS process happen. But we're now seeing people who are in that green card process getting deported, not where the time is not being allowed for people to in fact get through that process. And we just heard from Attorney General Jeff Sessions that he is looking into whether or not he can basically tell the immigration judges that they can no longer do those administrative closures. He just wants people out. And it's pretty clear. Because the motto is, and it's said in some of the executive orders, is hire America, America first. And that's where, a lot of people are coming from, even when it's for industries that need workers. So when I was talking about, some of the changes that people feel are needed to the immigration laws, and some even for for whether it's temporary workers or full-time employees, there are businesses who are otherwise, you would say, are fairly conservative people, just screaming for these changes, increasing the caps, because they're unable to hire people locally. So it's hard to understand. It really is hard to understand, except that when the president runs on a platform of, decreasing immigration, that's what he wants to deliver. And so I think that that's what's happening. And there are a lot of, hardliners in this administration who are supporting that. Stephen Miller in the White House, Jeff Sessions. When I talked about Senator Leahy chairing Judiciary and getting the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act of 2013 through the Senate, then Senator Sessions was just adamantly opposed to this. And listened to, he challenged and commented on every single amendment and every provision of this bill. So it was not a surprise that this is, he's the person who it wasn't the president who spoke about, who conveyed the decision about ending DACA. It was Attorney General Sessions who made that speech. So you are talking about applying for a real ID, which is a specific category of license. The other license, that's basically I'm trying to remember what the phrase is. Excuse me? No, it's a driver's license, but it's not the full real ID where you have to pull out, all kinds of proof of who you are, et cetera. Those other ones are not just for people who are undocumented. I know many U.S. citizens who don't want to pull out and gather all that other evidence, and people I know in the administration who have those other forms of licenses, and they can't be used for certain things, but they are a driver's license. So the number of driver's licenses that are you think are all for people who are undocumented, it also includes U.S. citizens can get those licenses as well. So the number I think the majority of those licenses are going to people who are U.S. citizens. There's the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and there's a website to help find attorneys. It might also be worthwhile, depending upon, what state did you say, New Jersey?
They live in New Jersey, right just outside of New York.
There are organizations that focus on helping people with asylum applications, you know, NGOs that, and you might want to talk with them because they may have private attorneys that they're working with. So I'll have my card here. You can call me and I can get you connected to those.
And could someone in New Jersey use an immigration lawyer in New York?
It is, immigration law, as I was saying before, is a federal law. Okay, you can have, there are many people here who have lawyers, you know, even though we have great immigration lawyers in Vermont, people use attorneys in Chicago, LA, it doesn't matter, it's nationwide. Thank you everybody for coming and participating.